April 1850, Independence, Missouri. The mud in Independence was not merely soil and water. It was a living, breathing entity that swallowed boots, wagon wheels, and good intentions alike. It smelled of manure, sawdust, unwashed wool, and the sharp metallic tang of anxiety. Alara Vance stood on the corner of Liberty Street, the hem of her calico dress heavy with the dark sludge. She adjusted the bonnet that shielded her face from the deceptive spring sun, her eyes scanning the chaotic tapestry of the town. Independence, Missouri was no longer just a town. It was the funnel through which the restless spirit of a nation was pouring itself. $2 for a sack of flour? That is robbery, sir, and you know it, a man's voice boomed nearby. Alara turned to see her husband, Thomas, his face flushed a deep crimson, standing toe-to-toe with a merchant whose eyes gleamed with the predatory patience of a man who knew he held all the cards. "Supply and demand, Mr. Vance," the merchant said, leaning back against a stack of crates marked salt pork. "The whole world is heading west. If you don't buy it, the man behind you will." Thomas looked back at Alara. His eyes, usually the color of a calm autumn sky, were stormy. He looked tired. We haven't even left the state, Alara thought, and he already looks tired. But when he looked at her, the anger faded, replaced by that stubborn, terrifying hope that had uprooted their lives. He nodded to the merchant and slapped the coins onto the barrelhead. This was the Oregon fever. It wasn't an illness of the body, but of the soul. It had taken Thomas 3 years ago, reading the letters from those who had gone before, letters that spoke of the Willamette Valley as if it were Eden restored, soil so black and rich it would grow crops if you just whispered at it, trees taller than cathedrals, freedom from the debts that had slowly strangled their farm in Kentucky. Alara stepped forward as Thomas hefted the sack onto his shoulder. "That's the last of the dry goods, then?" she asked, her voice steady. "The last," Thomas said, exhaling. "Save for the coffee. I won't cross the Continental Divide without coffee, Alara." She managed a small smile. "Then let us find the coffee. And then, Thomas, let us go home. This town makes me feel like I am standing on the edge of a cliff." "We are, Elle," Thomas whispered, a sudden gravity taking him. He looked west, past the brick buildings, toward the rolling green hills that marked the end of civilization and the beginning of the void. The Vance homestead, a rented 2-room cabin on the outskirts of town, was a landscape of organized destruction. For weeks, Alara had been engaged in the heart-wrenching calculus of weight. Every object they owned had to be judged not by its sentimental value, but by its poundage. "The oxen can pull 2,500 pounds, Thomas had said. "The wagon weighs 1,300. That leaves us 1,200 pounds for food, tools, clothes, and 4 lives. Alara stood in the center of the room, holding a porcelain clock. It had been a wedding gift from her mother. It didn't work particularly well. It lost 10 minutes every day, but the painted roses on its face were the brightest things in her life. "Mama?" Alara turned. Her son, Ben, 10 years old and vibrating with the energy of a colt, was standing in the doorway. He was holding a wooden toy musket Thomas had whittled for him. "Are we taking the clock?" Ben asked. Alara looked at the clock, then at the trunk that was already overflowing with linens and winter coats. She looked at the guidebook lying on the table, The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California, which warned strictly against superfluous furniture and trumpery. "No, Ben," Alara said softly. She walked to the mantel and placed the clock down gently, as if it were sleeping. "We are leaving it for the next family. Maybe they will need to know what time it was yesterday." Ben didn't understand the joke, but he nodded. "Can I take my marbles? If they fit in your pocket, you can take them. If they don't, they stay." The brutality of the packing was a physical ache. They were stripping themselves bare. The heavy cast iron stove? Sold. The walnut bed frame? Sold. The books? Most of them sold, save for the Bible, a volume of Shakespeare, and the guidebook. They were trading their past for a wagon. Later that evening, the wagon arrived. It was a Murphy wagon, built of seasoned hardwood, wheels rimmed with iron. It was smaller than Alara had imagined, yet looming. Thomas called it a prairie schooner. To Alara, it looked like a small boat meant to sail a sea of grass. The white canvas cover was stretched taut over the hickory bows, glowing ghostly pale in the twilight. Thomas ran his hand along the wheel. "She's sturdy, Alara. Hickory and oak. She'll take the rocks. She'll take the river." "It's not the wagon I worry about, Thomas," Alara said, wrapping her shawl tighter against the evening chill. "It's what happens when the wheels stop turning." Thomas came to her, wrapping her arms around her waist. He smelled of pine and sweat. "We are doing this for them," he said, nodding toward the cabin where Ben and little Sarah, only 6, were asleep. "There is nothing left for them here but toil and debt. Out there, a man can breathe. A woman can own her own future." "Independence," Alara murmured, looking at the distant lights of the town. "It is a strange name for a place where everyone is leaving." "It's a promise," Thomas said. "The town is just the starting line." 3 days later, the chaos of departure descended. The jumping-off point was a sensory overload. Hundreds of wagons were gathering in the staging meadows. The air was thick with the bellowing of oxen, the sharp crack of bullwhips, the crying of children, and the fervent prayers of preachers who walked among the families, handing out tracts and warnings. Alara sat on the wagon seat, the canvas arching over her head like a tunnel. Behind her, packed with Tetris-like precision, was their entire life. 200 pounds of flour, 150 pounds of bacon, sacks of sugar, beans, dried fruit, the Dutch oven, the rifles, the ammunition, and the bedding. Sarah sat beside her, clutching a rag doll. Ben was outside with Thomas, helping to yoke the oxen. They had 4 oxen, sturdy, placid beasts named Thunder, Lightning, a joke as they were agonizingly slow, Moses and Aaron. "Keep the yoke loose on the neck, boy," Thomas instructed Ben. "Too tight and you'll choke him on the uphill." A man rode up on a large bay horse. It was Silas Thorne, the wagon master elected by their company of 30 wagons. Thorne was a man made of leather and gristle, a veteran of the Santa Fe Trail. He had eyes that seemed to squint permanently against a sun that wasn't shining. "Vance," Thorne barked, "you ready to roll? We lose the light, we lose the miles, and I won't have stragglers on day 1. "We are ready, Mr. Vance," Thomas said, rubbing his hands on his trousers. He looked up at Alara. The fear was gone from his face, replaced by a focused intensity. "Climb up, Ben," Thomas said. As the boy scrambled onto the running board, Thomas walked to the front of the oxen. He picked up the long whip, not to strike, but to guide. "It is time, El," Thomas whispered. Alara looked back. The cabin they had rented was already invisible, obscured by the mass of other wagons and the dust kicking up from the road. I looked at the town of Independence. It was a bustling, muddy, greedy, hopeful mess. I realized I would likely never see a brick building again for 6 months. I would never see my mother's grave in Kentucky again. A horn blew, a long, mournful sound from the front of the train. "Roll 'em," Thorne's voice carried over the wind. "Hoop, hoop, Moses, Aaron," Thomas called out. The oxen groaned, their massive shoulders bunching. The chains pulled taut with a metallic clank. The wagon shuddered. For a second I thought it wouldn't move, that the weight of their possessions and their sins was too heavy. But then, with a lurch that snapped her head back, the great iron-rimmed wheels began to turn. The wood creaked, a sound that would become the soundtrack of their lives. Creak, groan, creak, groan. They began to move, not fast, a walking pace, the speed of a heartbeat. Alara gripped the wooden bench. They were passing other families. Some were cheering, others were weeping openly. A woman in a blue bonnet was walking beside her wagon, reading a Bible aloud, her voice breaking on the Psalms. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." As they cleared the edge of town, the noise of humanity began to recede, replaced by the wind rippling through the tall grass. They were entering the prairie. The horizon stretched out, impossibly wide, a terrified blue line that separated the earth from the sky. Thomas walked beside the oxen, his hand resting gently on Moses' flank. He looked back at Alara and smiled, a genuine boyish smile. "Westward, Alara," he shouted over the creak of the wheels. Alara looked forward. The road was just a set of rots cut into the earth by those who had gone before. It led into the vast and different green. She reached into her pocket and felt the cool glass of a single marble she had saved from Ben's collection, the one he thought he had lost. A small piece of the past. "Westward," she whispered to herself. The wheels turned. The mud of Independence fell from the rims, replaced by the dust of the trail. The promise had been made. Now they had 2,000 miles to keep it.
The horizon had stopped being a line and had become a cage. For the first month, the prairie had been a novelty, a lush, rolling ocean of green that whispered promises of fertility. But as the Vance family pushed past the invisible boundary of the 100th meridian, the world stripped itself of color. The green faded to a bruised ochre, then to the pale, dusty gray of sagebrush. The air grew dry, sucking the moisture from their lips and the patience from their souls. They were following the Great Platte River Road, a flat, monotonous ribbon that seemed to stretch into eternity. The river itself was a cruel joke, a mile wide and an inch deep, the men said. Too thick to drink, too thin to plow. Alara walked beside the wagon. The seat was too jarring now, the ruts deep and hardened by the sun. Her boots, once sturdy leather, were scuffed and gray with alkali dust. That dust was everywhere. It was in the food, in the water, in the folds of their clothes, and deep in the creases of Thomas's face. "Keep moving," Thomas rasped. His voice had changed. The hopeful lilt of independence was gone, replaced by a gravelly command born of necessity. "Don't let the gap widen, Alara." They were falling behind the main body of the train. Moses, their lead ox, was limping. A stone bruise, Silas Thorne had called it. Pack it with tar and keep walking, was the order. There was no stopping. To stop was to die. The whispers began here, in the long, flat silence of the high plains. They weren't voices exactly. They were the sounds of the wind hissing through the sage, the creak of drying wood, and the murmurs of doubt rippling through the wagon train like a fever. The chimney and the split. The first major rupture in the group's unity occurred under the shadow of Chimney Rock. It rose out of the flat earth like a warning finger of God, a towering spire of clay and volcanic ash that could be seen for days before they reached it. It was magnificent and terrifying. To Ben, it was a giant's needle. To Alara, it looked like a tombstone for the world they had left behind. They camped at its base. The wagons circled tight, not against Indians, who had been largely trading partners thus far, but against the vastness of the night. Around the campfire, the tension that had been simmering for weeks finally boiled over. Jedediah Krell, a man with a face like a hatchet and eyes that always seemed to be calculating the weight of his neighbor's supplies, stood up. He held a tin cup of coffee that steamed in the cool night air. "Thorne?" Krell spat, looking at the wagon master. "We're crawling. 12 miles today. 12. At this pace, the snows will catch us in the Sierras before we even smell the Pacific." Silas Thorne sat on a log, whittling a piece of hickory. He didn't look up. "We move at the pace of the weakest ox, Krell. That's the rule." "The rule is survival," Krell shouted, gesturing to the darkness. "I heard from a rider today, a Pony Express man. He says there's a cutoff, Sublet's cutoff. Saves 50 miles of desert. We bypass Fort Bridger." "We need the fort," Thorne said calmly, slicing a curl of wood. "The Vances need to reshoe an ox. The Millers need flour." "The Vances are dead weight." Krell turned his gaze on Thomas. Thomas stood up slowly. He was thinner than he had been in Missouri. His shirt hung loose on his frame, but his arms were roped with new, hard muscle. "My oxen pull their share, Krell. Moses is healing." "He's slowing us down," Krell sneered. "I say we split. Those who want to make time, come with me. We take the cutoff. Those who want to nurse sore hooves can stay with Thorne and rot in the snow." A silence descended on the camp, heavier than the darkness. This was the great divide of the spirit before they even reached the mountains. The unity of the wagon train was their only shield against the wilderness. To fracture was to invite disaster. Alara watched the faces around the fire. She saw fear in the eyes of the mothers, calculation in the eyes of the fathers. "No one splits," Thorne said, driving his knife into the log. He stood up, his silhouette blocking out the stars. "You take the cutoff alone, Krell, and if your wheel breaks, you die alone. If you run dry, you thirst alone. Is that what you want?" Krell spat into the fire. Better alone than dragged down by the weak. But he sat down. The mutiny was quelled, for now, but the whisper of it remained. The trust was broken. From that night on, neighbors watched each other not as friends, but as liabilities. The register of the desert. Days turned into weeks. The landscape began to buckle and heave. The flat plains gave way to rocky foothills. The air grew thinner, crisp and biting in the mornings, scorching by noon. They reached Independence Rock in early July. It was a massive granite turtle shell nesting on the valley floor. It was known as the Register of the Desert. Thousands of names were carved, painted, or tarred on its surface, a desperate attempt by insignificant humans to leave a mark on an indifferent geology. "Can we write our names, Papa?" Ben asked, running his hand over a carving that read,
J. Boone, 1848. "We don't have tar to spare, Ben," Thomas said, checking the harness on the oxen. Alara looked at the rock. She saw names of people she knew had died on the trail weeks ago. A shiver went through her. "Thomas," she said, "let him." Thomas looked at her, exhausted. "We are here," Alara said firmly. "We exist. Let the boy write it." Thomas sighed and handed Ben a small pot of axle grease. Ben found a spot near the base of the rock. With painstaking care, he daubed the letters. Ben Vance, 1850. Going home. Alara stared at the words. Going home. He didn't mean Kentucky. He meant a place he had never seen. To a child, home was where the wagon stopped. That night, Sarah fell ill. It wasn't cholera, the great terror of the trail, but mountain fever. She burned with heat, her small body thrashing in the narrow bed of the wagon. Alara spent 3 nights without sleep, pressing wet rags to her daughter's forehead. The water was precious, hauled from the Sweetwater River, which was becoming a narrow, twisting serpent guiding them upward. "She needs rest," Thomas whispered on the 4th morning. Sarah was pale, her breathing shallow. "We cannot stop," Thomas said, his voice cracking. "Krell is watching. If we stop, they will leave us." "Let them leave," she hissed, grabbing his arm. "She is your daughter. And if we are left behind, we all die," Thomas snapped. It was the first time he had raised his voice at her. He stopped, horrified by his own tone. He slumped against the wagon wheel, burying his face in his hands. "Alara, I don't know what to do. The oxen are failing. The water is bad. If we stop..." Alara touched his shoulder. She realized then that the burden of leadership was crushing him. He was trying to outrun winter, outrun starvation, outrun his own inadequacy. "We will put her in the sling," Alara said softly. "I will walk beside the wagon and fan her. We keep moving. But we pray, Thomas. We pray harder." The ascent. The climb to South Pass was not what they expected. They had anticipated jagged peaks and steep cliffs, a dramatic wall to scale. Instead, the approach to the Continental Divide was a long, punishingly gradual slope. It was a deception. The grade was gentle, but it was relentless. Mile after mile, day after day, they were walking uphill. The air grew thin. Men and beasts gasped for breath. Noses bled spontaneously. The sun was brighter here, sharper, burning the skin even through shirts. The whispers became literal wind. It roared through the granite cracks, a constant howling companion that made conversation impossible. It rattled the canvas covers, shaking the wagons as if trying to toss them off the spine of the world. The oxen were suffering the most. Moses was skeletal, his ribs showing through his hide like the staves of a barrel. Every step was a battle of will against gravity. "He's done, Vance," Krell shouted as he passed them one afternoon. Krell's wagon was light. He had abandoned his cast-iron stove miles back. "Cut him loose before he drops and blocks the trail." "He pulls," Krell shouted back, his face mask-like with dust. "He's done," Krell said, jumping down from his horse. "Put him down, Vance, or I will. You're blocking the road." Alara stepped between Krell and the ox. She didn't have a weapon, but the look in her eyes stopped Krell in his tracks. She looked like a fury of the plains, hair windblown, face sunburned, eyes blazing. "You will not shoot this animal," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "He has carried us 1,000 miles. He dies with dignity, or he does not die today." "Alara," Thomas said softly. "Unhitch him," she commanded Thomas. "Yoke the milk cow. Bessie is strong. She can take the left yoke." "A cow?" Krell laughed. "You want to cross the divide with a milk cow in the yoke?" "She is strong," Alara repeated. "Unhitch him." Thomas looked at his wife, then at Krell. He nodded. He unhitched Moses. The great ox didn't rise. Thomas stroked the animal's head one last time, whispering a thank you, and then turned away. He would not watch him die. They yoked Bessie, the milk cow, next to Aaron. It was a desperate, pathetic sight, the mismatched team. But when Thomas cracked the whip, Bessie leaned into the wood. The wagon moved. They left Moses behind. As they crested the rise, Ben looked back. A single wolf was already watching from a ridge. Ben didn't cry. He just gripped the side of the wagon until his knuckles were white. He was learning the cruelest lesson of the West. Nothing is kept that cannot be carried. South Pass, the Great Divide. 2 days later, they reached the summit. It was in Insomniacs. South Pass was a wide, flat saddle of sagebrush and rock, 20 miles wide. You could hardly tell you were at the top of the continent. except for the way the light seemed to fracture and the way the lungs burned. Thorne called a halt at Pacific Springs. "Drink," Thorne shouted, pointing to the marshy water. "Look closely, folks." Thomas cupped the water in his hands. It was cold, freezing cold. He let it drip through his fingers. "Do you see?" Thorne asked. "Yesterday the water flowed east, back to the Mississippi, back to the homes you left. This water flows west. It flows to the Colorado, to the Green, to the Pacific Ocean." A hush fell over the group. Alara stood by the spring. She looked east, back the way they had come. Somewhere back there, miles and miles away,